This is our second lecture on fasting, and to those unfamiliar with the subject, perhaps the most surprising thing about this material is that Jesus did expect His followers to fast. Fasting is expected for Christians. Notice the words of Jesus at the beginning of Matthew 6, verses 16 to 17 as one of the expressions of this expectation that we're to fast. He says there, "And when or whenever you fast," not if, but when you fast, but when you fast, he says there also in verse 17. Now this expectation is made even more clear when you compare that with passages earlier in the same paragraph, in the same chapter there. Up in verses 2 and 3 of Matthew chapter 6, he says this about giving. So when you give, not if, but when you give, he says it twice. Then again, in the passage right after that, verses 5 through 7, about prayer, he says, "And when you pray," but when you pray, and when you pray. See the parallelism there? When you give, when you pray, when you fast. No one doubts that we're to give, no one doubts that we're to pray. We use these passages to emphasize that. But somehow we've overlooked the fact that in the very same passage, in the very same language, is this parallelism about fasting. And since there's nothing here or elsewhere in Scripture indicating that we no longer need to fast, we know that also Christians in the book of Acts fasted. I think we can safely conclude Jesus still expects His followers to fast today. But plainer still are the words of Jesus in 3 chapters later, Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 and 15, we're told in the passage where the disciples of John the Baptist were having a problem with Jesus eating because and feasting sometimes because John the Baptist had taught them to fast. The disciples of John the Baptist knew that the Pharisees fasted, and so how is it that Jesus didn't require His followers to fast? And he says this in verses 14 and 15. They asked Jesus, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast." Well, this is the time when Jesus has been taken away, the bridegroom has been taken away, the time is now. That's the time He said His disciples will fast. And we will do so until He returns. In fact, fasting, according to John Piper, is one indication of our longing for His return. Piper says, Christian fasting at its root is the hunger of a homesickness for God. It seems the only way to answer the ache that we have in our hearts for the consummation of all things when we will at last be with God, when He will make all things right, is an indication that we will fast. He will incline our hearts toward these things with the result that we will fast. Now, the only instructions we're given on how to fast are in Matthew chapter 6 and verses 16 to 18. And we return to that where He gives a negative command, a positive command, and a promise. The negative command is first when He says to them, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen to others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward." What reward did they want? To be seen fasting, to impress people as being pious. And they got that, but that's all they got. But Jesus said, when you fast, don't announce it by the way you look. Don't look miserable. Don't try to convey how hungry you are. Don't neglect your appearance. The positive command is next. He says, but when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in heaven. So instead of looking like some hungry scavenger, you want to present yourself in such a way that no one can tell by your appearance that you're fasting. The only one who should know is the one who sees in secret. So no one else should know that you're fasting unless it's absolutely necessary or it's unavoidable. Now, if you are part of a congregational fast, I think it's acceptable to speak with someone who is also fasting. How is it going for you? What are you learning from this? And so forth. So since people already presume you are fasting, it's all right to discuss it. It may be necessary if someone is preparing meals for you. I mean, it's just a courtesy to say, I won't be eating today. And so in that case, you need to convey to someone in some way that those who prepare food for you don't need to do so. And they may say, well, why? If they ask that you're fasting, well, yes, I am. And sometimes it's just unavoidable. What Jesus is trying to convey here is not a mere prohibition that anyone know that you're fasting. What he's prohibiting is wanting people to know that you're fasting. That was the error of the Pharisees. He said they do all that they do to their faces and their appearance so that they may be seen fasting by others. And that's what he's trying to get us to avoid is wanting people to know that we're fasting. But sometimes it's unavoidable. So what he's against is something like this. Someone comes in and says, hey, why don't you go to lunch with us today? No thanks, no, not today. And if they say, why, are you fasting? Well, some people have the attitude of, well, oh yes, I am. Now you've ruined it. Now I had to tell you and it's all for nothing. No, that's not what Jesus is against. It's not that do people find out. It's do you want them to find out? It's not as though the fast is ruined if someone finds out. What he's against is do you want them to find out? So if someone comes in and says, well, why don't you go to lunch with us today? Well, I'd like to, believe me, because I am so hungry. Oh, I'm so hungry, but no thanks. Not today. Not going with you today. Well, why not? Are you fasting? Well, now that you mention it, yes, I am. That's what Jesus is against. It's not, does anyone find out that you're fasting? Is are you trying to let them find out that you are fasting? If someone came into a room with a closed door and they found you in there on your knees and they said, oh, I'm sorry, were you praying? What are you going to do, lie about it? Yes, I was praying. And in the same way, if someone directly asks you, are you fasting? Sure, you say yes, you don't make a big deal out of it. But it's not as though the fast is ruined if someone finds out. What ruins a fast is you wanting them to find out. You trying to cultivate a situation in which they do find out. Now, the promise is given to us in verse 18, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Does it say how He will reward you? No. Does it say when He will reward you? No. But none of His rewards is worthless. And that promise that He will reward you is as sure and true as any promise in the Bible. We don't know whether that reward will be any of it here in this world or in the next world. We don't know the nature of it, but we know it's as sure as any promise in the Bible that those who fast biblically, He will reward. Now it's interesting, He gives us no instructions on how often we are to fast. It is something that is available to us whenever we desire. It's never to devolve into just an empty legalistic routine, but it's a blessing we may enjoy whenever we choose. And we also have no instructions on how long we are to fast. In the Bible, and there are the references for all of these in your textbook, but in the Bible we find examples of fasts that lasted one day or part of a day, a one-night fast, 3-day fasts, 7-day fasts, a 14-day fast, a 21-day fast, 40-day fasts, and fasts of unspecified lengths. So strictly speaking, a fast can consist of a one-meal fast. Your assignment for this class is a fast of at least 24 hours. So if you have breakfast perhaps, then you wouldn't eat lunch or supper and wait until breakfast again. But technically speaking, a fast can be as brief as one meal. The length of your fast is up to you and the leadership of the Holy Spirit. But of all the things that I will say about fasting, perhaps the most important is the one right now when we see that fasting is to be done for a purpose, a biblical purpose. Because without this, fasting becomes just a miserable, self-centered exercise. And you'll become like one writer who, someone told this writer on fasting, "I've fasted on several occasions and nothing happened. I just got hungry." Several years ago, I heard a couple of pastors discussing fasting, and on their recommendation, I tried my first fast. They said it was commanded in the Bible and should be practiced by every Christian. Being a Christian, I decided to try it. After putting it off for several days, I mustered up enough courage to start. I couldn't go to the breakfast table with my family because I didn't think I would have enough willpower to abstain from eating, so I went on to work. The coffee break was almost unbearable, and I told a little white lie about why I didn't go with the group. All I could think about was how hungry I was. I said to myself, if I ever get through this day, I will never try this again. The afternoon was even worse. I tried to concentrate on my work, but all I could hear was the growling of my stomach. My wife prepared a meal for herself and our child, and the aroma of the food was all I could bear. I figured that if I could make it until midnight, I would have fasted all day. I did, but immediately after the striking the hour of 12, I dug into food. I don't think that day of fasting helped me one bit. And you know what? It didn't. He was right. It didn't help him one bit because he had no biblical purpose for his fast. It was just something to be endured. His thought the entire time was, how long till this is over? Now, you have received an assignment that you are to fast at least, you are to fast twice during the course of the semester, once before this lecture, and then once after watching this lecture. And you have learned by experience now what it's like to fast without a biblical purpose. I merely assign you to fast, and you did that assignment just because it was an assignment. And you had evil thoughts of me the entire time during that assignment. And unless my guess is wrong, during the whole time you were thinking evil thoughts of me and how much longer till this is over. Now, you have learned by experience, never do that again. And more importantly, in your future teaching about the subject of fasting, don't let people assume that's what you're calling them to do. Make sure in the future, in your next fast, and in all future fasts, and in your teaching on the subject, you emphasize a biblical purpose. Without that, it's just a miserable, self-centered experience where perhaps we think somehow God will be impressed by the fact that we have inflicted suffering on ourselves, and that will impress Him in some way to bless us, which is a legalistic, works-oriented righteousness. And that's not what we're teaching. And so I've given you an assignment where you learn that the hard way, but I hope sufficiently impressed upon you the wrong way to fast without a biblical purpose. So I think this is the single most important concept to take away from this lecture. So here's what it looks like in real life. Here's how you can determine if you're fasting with the right motive or the wrong one. When your stomach growls, when your head aches, and you say to yourself, man, I'm hungry, your next thought is going to be, oh, that's right, I'm hungry because I'm fasting today. If your next thought is, how much longer till this is over, you're doing it wrong. Your next thought ought to be, and I'm fasting for this purpose. So when your stomach growls, your head aches, and you say, man, I'm hungry, you're going to think, oh, that's right, I'm hungry because I'm fasting today. Your next thought should be, and I'm fasting for this biblical purpose. And that's how your hunger serves you. Your hunger serves your greater purpose and does so all day long. So that's why you want to feel some hunger. It serves your greater purpose. Without it, fasting becomes just an end in itself and takes you away from the gospel. And it descends into some deception that perhaps your suffering earns a favor from God. So even though it's unpleasant, you want to feel some degree of hunger during your fast. It's a continual reminder of your spiritual purpose. So for example, here's what it looks like. Suppose that your purpose was to pray for your spouse, to pray for someone's salvation. All day long, whenever you get hungry, you're prompted to pray for your spouse, to pray for your child's salvation or someone else's salvation. So, again, what does it look like? Your stomach growls, your head aches, and you think, man, I'm really hungry. Oh, that's right, I'm hungry because I'm fasting today. Oh, that's right, I'm fasting to pray for my spouse. And so all day long, you're praying for your spouse. That's why your hunger serves you. Your greater purpose is not to suffer. Your greater purpose is to pray. And it's so important to you, you want to do it all day long. And it's so important for you to pray this often that you're willing to place that above your own comfort, and you allow your discomfort to prompt you to a greater, higher purpose. So your goal is not just to suffer and inflict that upon yourself and think that somehow that impresses God. Your goal is to pray for your spouse. That spiritual outcome is what you want more than anything right now. And your constant reminder of your hunger is the constant reminder of prayer for your spouse or for that person's salvation. So do you see, this is why you want to experience some hunger. It serves you. It helps you. Because you have a purpose that says, there's something I want more than I want lunch. I want my child to be saved. I want this prayer to be answered. I want that so much I'm willing to disregard food for a while. Even though God made me to live on food, it's more important to me right now to pursue this biblical purpose than even to eat the food that I have to live on. So your hunger serves you. It's a good thing because you've got something driving you right now that's greater than hunger. Now, the Bible sets forth many purposes for fasting, and we're about to look at some of these. So the Bible sets forth several purposes for fasting. I've condensed them into 10 major categories, and notice that none of them is to earn God's favor. That's a useless attempt to impress God and earn His acceptance. That comes only by the suffering of Christ, not by our suffering. And our faith in His suffering for us is what makes us acceptable to God. So let's return to the gospel and the work of Jesus. And we fast for the purpose of godliness. We fast for the purpose of conforming to Christ, who fasted, and to experience God and His blessings that He's promised through fasting. So, whenever you fast, one of these purposes should come to mind throughout your fast. The one that's most common is to strengthen prayer. John Calvin said, whenever men are to pray to God concerning any great matter, it would be expedient to appoint fasting along with prayer. Because there's something about fasting that sharpens the edges of our intercession and adds an importunity to our praying, a passion for our supplications. So whenever the people of God throughout history have felt a special urgency about anything, they've often appointed fasting with prayer. So for example, when Ezra was about to lead a group of exiles back to Jerusalem, he proclaimed a fast so that they would seek God's blessing. They were going to face many dangers. You got thousands and thousands of people, including children, and they have no military protection, and they got a long way to go, and they have these priceless articles that were going to go back into the temple. So we fasted and implored our God for this, says Ezra 8:23, and He listened to our entreaty. So the Bible does not teach that fasting is kind of a spiritual hunger strike that twists God's arm, so to speak, and forces Him to do our bidding. If we ask for something outside of God's will, you can fast until you die, and that's not going to cause God to reconsider. Fasting doesn't change God's hearing so much as it does our praying and our attitude toward what we pray about. One way it changes us is that it is, as Piper put it, an intensifier of our spiritual desires. I like that. An intensifier of our spiritual desires. In what some have said is the only book on fasting written in the first half of the 20th century by a Christian, Arthur Wallace, in the book God's Chosen Fast, said, fasting is calculated to bring a note of urgency and importunity into our praying, and to give force to our pleading in the court of heaven. The man who prays with fasting is giving heaven notice he is truly in earnest. Not only so, but he is expressing his earnestness in a divinely appointed way. He is using a means that God has chosen to make His voice to be heard on high. Note that biblical fasting is God's idea. It wasn't developed in a monastery. It wasn't developed by someone who thought that they could suffer in such a way as to earn God's favor. It's not man's idea. Fasting, I remind you again and again, is in the Bible. Fasting is God's idea. So He is always pleased to hear our prayers, but He's also pleased when we choose a means He has chosen to strengthen our praying. Another biblical figure who added fasting to prayer is Nehemiah. It says he continued fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Daniel, in chapter 9, verse 3, devoted himself to plead with God by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting. So prayer and fasting. And in a direct divine command through the prophet Joel, the Lord said, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning." And it wasn't until after fasting and praying, so those two together there, fasting and praying, that the church in Antioch laid their hands on Barnabas and Saul of Tarsus and sent them off on the first missionary journey. That's Acts 13:3. So of all the purposes found in Scripture, and we're eventually going to review 10 of them, this would be the one you encounter most often, to strengthen prayer. And so in one way or another, really all the biblical purposes we're going to cover would be somehow related to prayer. So one of the best friends we can introduce to our prayer life is the biblical practice of fasting. Here's a second biblical purpose, so that when your stomach growls, when your head aches, and you say, "Man, I'm fasting, I'm hungry." Oh, that's right, because I'm fasting. Perhaps what should come to mind is you're seeking God's guidance, which you can see the connection with prayer on that as well. But your main purpose is clarity on God's will for your life. In Judges 20, the other 11 tribes prepared for war against the tribe of Benjamin. And so because of Benjamin's, their tribe's shocking sin there in that passage. And so they fasted that day until evening, seeking the Lord's will about whether they should continue this fight. They had attacked Benjamin, they had lost, and they fasted to seek God's guidance as to whether they should continue. And the Lord answered and said, "Go up, tomorrow we'll give them into your hand." But in the New Testament, Acts 14:23, again, Paul and Barnabas, before they would appoint elders in the churches they had founded, they would first, it says, fast and pray to determine which of these new converts should be the leaders of the church. And David Brainerd, we've mentioned earlier in this course, the young missionary friend of Jonathan Edwards, in whose home Edwards died when Brainerd was in his late 20s, prayed with fasting to discern the Lord's leadership regarding his entry into the ministry. And that story is found in your textbook, as he fasted at length to determine, "Lord, what is your will for me?" And perhaps for you, it might be a clarifier. Doubtless you're watching this video in the first place because you are already committed to Christian ministry of some sort. But perhaps you're one of those many students we have who just know the next step is seminary. They're not sure what they're to do once they graduate. Is God calling them to the mission field? Is it something in the local church? Perhaps that's where you are right now. And one of the means God would use to further clarify His direction would be by means of fasting. So fasting does not ensure, let's make clear about that, fasting doesn't ensure the certainty of receiving clear guidance from God. Again, we can't force God to speak directly and clearly without mistake just because we fast. But fasting does make us more receptive to the one who does love to guide us.